My talk this morning is on, as Carl pointed out, the World War I Aviation memorabilia collection at the museum, Golden Age Air Museum. How many people have been to the Golden Age Air Museum? Okay, so there is a road trip in your future, apparently. The museum is in Bethel, Pennsylvania. As Carl pointed out, it's a one traffic light, one post office town. On the other side of the highway, in the suburbs of Bethel, is the museum. And it's a 55-acre grass field with about 17 flying 20s, 30s, and World War I aircraft, and about 17 more projects hanging in the rafters that we, if we live long enough, we'll get around to building. My role at the museum is as the director. I was brought on because of my World War I interest, and it's been a fortunate marriage because I keep my airplane there. I have a 1930 Fleet that I fly. It's a two-seat, if you don't know the airplane, it's a two-seat open cockpit biplane. It's just one step away from World War I aircraft. I've been able to fly their Sopwith Pup, which is a unique airplane. We have, as Carl pointed out, we have a Fokker Triplane there, a rotary powered, a run powered triplane. We have a part scale Rumpler. We're working on a SPAD 13. We have an original 1917 Curtiss Jenny. And I'm going to talk about those airplanes just real quickly as we go through this. But if you haven't been to the museum before, I encourage you to come up. It's, as Carl pointed out, it's about from your home, it's about a 2.5-hour drive. From here, I think it's more like a 3.5 or 4-hour drive. So, this presentation, I'll apologize in advance for all of you folks who are very deeply steeped in the subject. This presentation will be a little bit light on historic detail in depth, but this is a presentation that I give at the museum for people who typically don't know that there was a war between 1914 and 1918, and that they did use airplanes during the war in 1914 and 1918. So I'm going to give you a couple of quick slides, overview of the war very quickly, and then we'll talk about the collection and the context of these wonderful items we have at the museum. It's called Case Histories because I didn't know what else to call it, and we keep these things in cases, so... You know there was a war before, how many people know there was a war between 1914 and 1918? Everybody?
Oh my God!
Okay, they had these things called trenches. That,
Were we in that?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. How many folks are familiar with the two combatant parties here, the Allies and the Central Powers? You have that? You know they used machine guns, poison gas, tanks, and airplanes, which is the reason we're here. So again, the primary audience for this, I give this course in a World War I Aviation 101 class at the museum during our July event, which is our World War I themed event. And it's typically presented to folks, again, who don't have a big background. So as we go through here, you'll see some of the collection. We have this flying Sopwith Pup, World War I introduced aircraft to the military. This beautiful reproduction Albatross D3. You've probably seen a lot of these photographs. It's in Austria. It's called Meyer airplane, built airplane. There's two of our airplanes, the Fokker Triplane and the Sopwith Pup. When the FAA is not around, we do stuff like this. When the FAA is there, we fly nice little circles and don't run into each other. It's not very exciting, but during the World War I event, the FAA is not around. So if you want to see two airplanes really trying to get on each other's tails, that's the day to come up. World War I introduced not only fighters, but bombing aircraft. Again, this is for the folks who don't have a background. So, Steve, are you familiar with the fact that there was bombing aviation in World War I or no?
I heard that.
Okay, I just want to make sure. For those who aren't aware, Steve is like the resident World War I aviation tactical and strategic bombing expert. The Junkers J-1, all-metal ground attack aircraft. And we'll talk about the airplanes briefly, but primarily this presentation is about the men and not the machines. As many of you know, there was several ways to get in aviation in World War I. We had what we call direct entry volunteers, or termed direct entry volunteers, who went into the air services of the combatant nations before the United States got involved. We had with the French, with the Royal Flying Corps. Many of them joined as if they were citizens. I'm sure John can tell you numerous stories about the French
With the French, you just go through the Foreign Legion. With the British, you just claim you were Canadian.
Right, and you didn't even have to prove that you were Canadian or a first generation. I have numerous stories in New Jersey, guys who went up and said, "Oh yeah, I live in Toronto." They wouldn't ask for an address. You could make something up. It didn't make any difference. Nobody was fact checking. They would just welcome you into service. And when you were in these units, you were British or French by command. So it wasn't as if you were under American command. Familiar with the Lafayette Escadrille? This is where I would talk about the U.S. early involvement, the American volunteers with the French, and how that influenced our ultimate decision to get into the war. The two mascots, whiskey and soda. And nobody, if I go past something and you say, I don't know what that is, I don't know why there were lions there, or why Mike is talking about that, please stop me. I'll be happy to take questions in the easy part here. And of course, you know the heraldry is the Sioux Indian head, which is going to play into the presentation in a little bit here. Royal Flying Corps, I talked about the volunteers with the French before. This is the volunteers with the Royal Flying Corps. A generic photograph. They fly SE-5s, they flew bombers, they flew all kinds of fighters, stopped with camels, you name it. And our guys didn't arrive until April of 1917, or didn't declare until April of 1917. We arrived quite a bit later than that. But once we entered the war and our air service started to get spun up, there was a realization that we were not really prepared for this conflict. And these factoids are more or less well accepted. We had less than 30 trained military pilots and no aircraft suitable for combat in Europe. That is true. Limited aircraft production capability. If you've read that debacle of a story from 1917 and 1918, you know where that's from. We had no Air Force. We had a branch of Signal Corps called the Air Service. We had limited flight training facilities in the U.S. We had no ground school infrastructure. Many of you know that 7 large universities in the United States were converted specifically for ground schools: Princeton University, Cornell, California, Berkeley, University of Georgia, among others, Ohio State University. But that wasn't in place when we entered the war. And we had limited agreements with foreign governments to accommodate training U.S. air crews. These guys were not going to be prepared for the influx of U.S. citizens as they started showing up in Europe, even as U.S. Air Service officers. They were just not ready for the influx. Case 1 is a U.S. pilot in training. We'll go through these one at a time. Each one of these cases has a uniform or a story of the memorabilia behind it. We talked about pilots in training here. This uniform is a pilot officer named Meyer, Claude Meyer from Ohio. There's also other items in that case from Sigurd Herzloff. You'll see a lot of New Jersey connections. How many people are familiar with my obsession with Jersey? Yeah. I grew up in New Jersey. I started a project to document all the New Jersey aviators who flew in World War I when I was 17 years old. Before I knew what I was doing, before I knew what I was getting into, before I could understand that a world war and New Jersey's small size and the fact that we were only there for a couple months didn't mean there would be a large number of guys. I started with 35 names and I have 762 biographies completed at present. So the project is literally taking me, it's 40 years at this point. Okay. So I've been doing this literally for my whole life. The point I want to make here is that a lot of these things you're going to see are New Jersey related. There's a reason for that, because my focus has been almost entirely on New Jersey contributions. Fortunately, we had aviators over early, joined with French, joined with the Brits, so I got a flavor for all of that activity as well, not just the U.S. Air Service. In the collection is Lieutenant Herzloff's FAI certificate and his uncut silver bullion wings. I don't know if you've seen collectors in here. I know Charlie Walthall is going to say, I've got 6 of those. I got 3 of them. I got 5 of those. But these uncut silver bullion wings were later cut down to size for pilot uniforms. But when they came out of the manufacturing stage, this is what they looked like. And Herzloff was a stateside pilot, trained in Kurdish Jenny, and crashed a couple of Kurdish Jennies. This is training in Texas and in Canada, by the way. And I'm pretty sure that the reason these guys crashed a lot was because they were doing stuff like this. I've seen great photographs of these guys sitting on this airplane. I saw one where this guy, if you're a pilot, you would know that there's this weight and balance thing with an airplane, right? I saw one with this guy sitting right here. He is, 14 feet behind the center of gravity or so. I'm not even sure how you keep the airplane level with the guy sitting back there. But we did that at the museum, as I pointed out earlier. We have an original 1918 Kurdish Jenny. It's got an original engine in it. It's an OX-5 engine. It flies at every one of our events. It's especially featured at the World War I event. It was restored over a period of 7 years by the staff and volunteers at the museum. And you may, if you're very tuned in to the aviation scene, you may know that in May of last year, a 16-year-old girl on her very first solo flight, on her 16th birthday at the Golden Age Air Museum, soloed in that airplane. So it didn't help, or it didn't hurt, excuse me, that she was the director's daughter. And she was Paul Dockery's daughter. Her name is Caroline. She's a remarkable young lady. Wants to be an aerobatics pilot, but we believe she's the first girl to, well, certainly the first girl to solo on her 16th birthday in a 100-year-old airplane. And we believe the first 16-year-old girl to ever solo, her first solo in a jet. So it's not like all the guys are just having the fun. You know, it's not the boys' toys, it's the girls. Our second pilot is Claude Meyer. He was a test pilot at Dissident, ultimately trained here in the States, got his FAI certificate in the States. And all the items you see here, if I haven't mentioned already, these items are in the collection. These are not photographs I pulled from someplace else, but things that you can see when you come to the museum. Trained at Dissident, as I stated, was held back as an airplane tester. And I didn't quite understand the role of the tester, except that after pilots crashed things, they would get to go out and make sure the airplane was put back together all right. We have Meyer's tunic, we have his pants as well, his logbook, which is a remarkable thing, and his daily diary, which he kept diligently. A few other bits and pieces. I discovered at some point along the way that I had a photograph that did not come with his collection of his ground school class from Ohio State University. So that's also in the display. But after these kinds of things happened, the airplanes were rebuilt, and not all of them were this ugly for rebuilds, but after they were rebuilt, it was Meyer's duty to fly these airplanes. Now, if you're a pilot, you know what a logbook looks like, and you know if you make a 5-minute flight or a 10-minute flight or a 15-minute flight, it's a single line, right? Time, date, aircraft serial number, blah, blah, blah. Meyer was so busy at Dissident that he didn't bother putting in individual flights. That's 25 flights on a 15-meter Newport, right? And they were each 10 minutes long, or he estimated them to be 10 minutes long. Okay? And just look at the times, look at the number of flights he's making every day. 25, 14, 24, 27, 20. Look at this one down here. 35 individual 10-minute flights on Newports as a tester. So I'm assuming that each one of these flights is an individual airplane. So every day, think of the number of airplanes that have to be wrecked to get this number of flights in just for testing purposes. Each one of those aircraft is coming out of the shop with some repair to it. But I thought this was remarkable. He also keeps record of this in his diary. He talks about how tired he is after jumping in the air, out of the airplane 25 or 30 times during the day.
Why does that one say combat?
I think that was a test flight where he was out actually flying the airplane, goofing around, doing something that he wanted to do as opposed to testing an airplane.
80 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, one flight for a full 80 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. An hour 20.
Maybe it was a mock combat with someone else in another plane.
Probably. And the instructors at Dissident, if you're not familiar with the training at Dissident, one of the fields is the combat field. The instructors, you've seen these wildly marked Newports. They look like fish, or they've got stars, or they're crazy painted airplanes. They were the combat instructor airplanes. And typically those guys would just tool around over the combat field and pick somebody out. And if they dove at you and got on your tail or came after you, your job was to mix it up with them. So this is probably one of those things. He probably said, you know what, I'm getting tired of doing this. I go up, I get in the airplane, I start the airplane, I fly, I take off, I come down, I test the engine, I test the controls, I land, that's it, 10 minutes, okay, I get in another airplane, I do this again. Let me go up and have some fun.
Well, that one was 160 horse Newport, too.
Yeah, there you go. Yep. What's that, 120? I think it's a 120.
120?
Yeah. Yeah, you probably get your butt beaten in 80 horsepower, of course. The French case, I will make full confessions here. This is an original tunic, but it's not an original aviation tunic. The badge is original, and the other bits in here are original, obviously. We're a little thin on French material, Charlie Walthall, and just saying. We could use a little additions to the Charlie Walthall collection at the museum. We're ready to rename it. We had American guys in French Air Service, as I pointed out. We had at least one New Jersey guy in the Lafayette Escadrille, Ronald Hostier from East Orange. And of course, before the United States entered, the French had very good fighter aviation of their own, as most of you know, although we like to kind of disparage the French contribution and the cheese-eating surrender monkey thing and all that. They were actually had very strong fighter aviation and aviation in general during the war and before. Jean Navarre here, one of their first aces in Lorraine Saulnier. They produced the Newport fighters, and parenthetically, we're working on a SPAD at the museum. And as much as we like to say, you know, the SPAD is a complicated, difficult airplane to build, and what were they thinking when they built this? The French produced some of the best airplanes in the war, fighters and bombers both. SPAD 13, this is the aircraft from La Ferté-Alais in France. It's an original airplane that they fly, original Tissot engine in it. And of course the French Breguet bomber, which is my favorite French bomber. Steve, your favorite French bomber?
I would say so, yes.
Yeah. Most widely used, beautiful photograph of the 96 Air Squadron Brigade here. And of course, French aviation produced aces, early aces, Peugeot, Charles Lanchester and René Fonck, 75 Victory Ace. And the beloved Georges Guillemer. For those of you who are familiar with the subject, you'll know that the French still say that he flew so high he couldn't come down. He was not killed in combat, he just flew so high he couldn't come down. And because we all need to be politically correct and expect that there will be a mention of some foreigner in the service, we have Eugene Jacques Ballard, who was an American first black fighter pilot in the U.S. And on the right side of that same case, we typically put in this other display. We talk about the aces and the famous pilots and the very unusual pilots, but the lion's share of the work was done by the unknowns. We have in the collection a brevet for a pilot named Jean-Marie. John, can you pronounce it? You?
Hugues.
I'm going to rely on John for my French pronunciation. His name is Hughes because he's American at this point, right? Not French. Hugues. Do that one more time, John.
Hugues.
Okay, that's his name. And his logbook. He never made it to the front. He finished his training, and I thought this was interesting as a pilot. How many people in here are rated pilots? Okay, you remember you're taking your triangular cross-country flight? Right, everybody was 150 miles on a leg or whatever it was at the time. They were doing this in World War I. And this is the entry for Mr.
Hugues.
Cross-country
There
flight.
was also a Marcel Hugues, and he was a 12 Victory Ace. Maybe they're related.
That could be. But this guy never got out of it, never got to the front, got in the training quite late.
It's a huge conclusion.
It's a huge leap of faith that they might be related. And here he is. We have two photographs. Fortunately, we have two photographs of the young man in training. It's a Codron G3 that he's in. The third case is this U.S. Air Service enlisted mechanic. In my research into the World War I activities of the New Jersey aviators, you certainly bump into the enlisted guys as well. One of the enlisted men was a guy named, his name was George McIntosh, almost lost that, from the Shore area in New Jersey. It was Beach Haven, New Jersey. And his family kindly provided his photo album. He was a 104th Aero Squadron mechanic. And you know, we talk about the pilots, but there's a lot of work. If you are building an airplane, or if you're building an airplane, or if you want to build an airplane, or you're working on airplanes, you know that the flying is sort of the culmination of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of work that these guys did. Love this shot with the Newport landing gear kind of sitting off to the side here. The rudder is right here. The airplane's completely apart. This kind of reminds me of the weekends out at the museum. This is pretty much what we're doing all weekend, putting airplanes back together. And this is probably my favorite photograph out of his album. You've got guys with hammers and cylinders and head palms and guns and all kinds of stuff, and they look like a mess, these guys. But these were the guys keeping the airplanes going. So while we like to talk about the glamour of the pilots, of the aviators themselves, these are really the engine for that activity. I point out that the museum is building a SPAD. It's a replica aircraft. It's got a steel tube core fuselage, not a wooden fuselage like the original. It does not have an original engine in it. It's got a 280 horsepower Continental in it. And it's quite a bit farther along than you see here now. Well, this is quite far along. Bottom wings are done. Front cowlings are just about done. The exhaust system is just about done. Parenthetically, my job on this airplane was this whole back end of the airplane. And I have to tell you that every time I built a component back here, I would say, why did they do this? It's so complicated. It doesn't look all that bad here, but if you ever built a German airplane, this would be one steel tube structure and be done with it. You could put it together in a week. Right? But the French, I wish I had a close-up of this. All of this structure here is, imagine cap strips with a web in between it. That part is a cap strip that runs here, a web, and a web. This is a cap strip on either side, a web, and a web. It is a giant jigsaw puzzle put together. So, they talk about building 7,000 of them during the war, 7,500, whatever the number was. I'm sure they built 5. And they just kept changing the markings on them, because there's no way you could finish 7,500 of these airplanes in 4 years. It's impossible.
You're going to also convince them to paint it up as number 15 from SPA 94?
No. What I'm going to do is what we already decided to do, John, which is paint it up as Charles Biddle's airplane. And the reason we're doing that is because Biddle was a Pennsylvania guy. Andalusia, Pennsylvania, commanding officer of the 13th Air Squadron. 7 victories, I believe. 7, John, or 8?
I think it was 8.
Yeah, I think it was 8.
Didn't he fly a SPAD 12 too?
He did. He flew a Cannon Spad, that's true. Didn't like the airplane very much.
He was ever cautious. He was still flying it behind the lines to get the full feel of it when the war ended, so he never got to use it in combat.
Fortunately, we have a photograph of the left side insignia that came off of this very airplane. It was in a collection in Washington State, so we're going to model ours right after that. So we were talking earlier, while we were out looking at the Sopwith Camel, about stenciling and hand painting, and if you looked at this closely, there's kind of a stencil that they may have used just to get the outlines and stuff, but this is all hand painted, and it's pretty rough when you look at it close. And those crosses are the same deal. But that'll be the markings on the airplane. We also have a rumpler. If you've read Biddle's book, The Way of the Eagle, he's got a very famous incident that happens in August of 1918 where he shoots down a rumpler. It's captured on his side of the lines. We have a rumpler to kind of recreate that event at the museum. Aimable in France, our tribute to the German aviators. It's very simple. Once again, a non-aviation tunic that's been dressed up as a German observer, assuming that the man was seconded to the air service. We have a military pass and a record book for a single German observer, and a beautiful wingnut wings kit. How many people are model builders in here? Wingnut wings, guys? Anybody? Build a wingnut wings? Nobody's built a wingnut wings kit except for me? Is that what I see?
Guess not.
I've got one.
You need to build it. This is like this. I stopped modeling because World War I aircraft are so difficult to put together. When you put this together, it almost takes no intelligence. I mean, it's really good for me because it takes no intelligence, and everything fits together beautifully. I'm not a spokesman for wingnut, but those models are the thing that got me back in aviation. And now that I'm of a certain age, 30-second scale is good for me because I can't. 40 scale is good anyway. But they really are beautiful kits. They put together beautifully. There's not a lot of fidgety parts in them. We're all familiar with one of the roles in German Air Service, just like our guys, high altitude reconnaissance. People are usually interested in the fact that they didn't have parachutes. The fighter pilots had them towards the end of the war, that they didn't have self-sealing gas tanks, that there was phosphorus ammunition being used, that if an airplane caught fire or lost a wing, there was no way to get out of it. They're also interested in the fact that there was no heat in the airplane. So, all the conveniences that we think of now were not there during World War I. And subsequently, when you tell folks now who are not steeped in this information, it's kind of a revelation to them to understand what these guys are going through. I talked about the museum having a part scale airplane. This is a part scale Rumpler C4. It has a Gypsy Major in it. I think it's a Gypsy Major engine. It's an inverted version of the engine. So if you know airplanes at all, the Gypsies ran with the cylinders down, right, like on the Tiger Moth. The engine was inverted, cylinders are up, so it looks good. This creates all kinds of oil scavenge problems that we ultimately figured out. We only had 2 forced landings in the airplane before we figured it out. First 2 out of the first 4 flights. This was not people's favorite airplane to fly. From that, and it's a primarily, if you look at the airplane, if you know anything about the Tiger Moths, you can kind of see Tiger Moth bones in it. There's some, every bit of this airplane was built from Tiger Moth parts and then kind of mocked up to be German-ish. It's about a 7A scale airplane. It flies awful. And when I say awful, I mean when we have an air show, we draw straws awful to see who gets to fly the airplane. But it's unique because it's one of the very few German 2-seaters flying in the country. And so it's a unique airplane for that aspect.
Wasn't it originally Turkish?
What's that?
Wasn't that plane originally Turkish when it was bedeviling Arabs in Lawrence of Arabia?
See, that's the story. The story we got with the airplane was it was built, there were 2 of them built for Lawrence of Arabia. Oops, sorry. Get out of that. It was originally built for Lawrence of Arabia, and then we were told by guys who built the airplane that it wasn't built for Lawrence of Arabia. It was actually built for the Biggles series. But in either case, it was either not used at all or it was used very sparingly as a movie airplane. And the reason it was used very sparingly, I am positive, is because it's an awful flying airplane. It's so bad, in fact, that nobody will get in the back cockpit. That's how bad. We had 1 passenger in it at one time during the first flight, which ended in a forced landing, which ripped the landing gear off the airplane. So after that, we decided it would be safer to have 150 pounds of sand in the back seat and not an actual body that might get hurt. But we fly it, in spite of all that, we fly the airplane regularly at our events. Uh-oh. Hey, Carl.
Mouse click on the application.
This guy.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm going to get my way out of it. Where'd it go? We also have a Fokker Triplane at the museum. It's a Lerone-powered airplane. It's as close as you're going to get, I think, to an original construction. Paul Doherty built this airplane. It took him, almost by himself, it took him 26 months. If you built an airplane, if you've ever built an airplane, you know that 26 months is an inordinately short amount of time to get an airplane done. But we had an 80 horsepower Lerone engine, and Paul's an animal when it comes to building stuff. So this airplane flies regularly. It's done in the colors of Lothar von Richthofen. Everybody has a red triplane, but there are very few, you know, of the other Richthofen flying around. We thought that would be appropriate. Case number 5, I call it backseater. This is a tribute to all the aerial observers. There's a half wing here, which was originally the junior military aviator wing, but was later converted to the observer wing in the U.S. Air Service. Tribute to a guy in the 166th Aero Squadron named Richard Smith Austin from New Jersey, from Bound Brook, New Jersey. We managed to acquire his uniform some years ago, and I was searching around on eBay randomly, as the collectors do, and ran into a Sam Brown belt that had his name written in 6 different locations inside the belt. So we reunited the belt with the uniform. When I asked the fellow who had the belt if there was anything else left of the collection, he said, "Oh, I think I know a gal. The gal that was dispersed in the collection. I think she has a couple of photo albums, but I'm not really sure." No, but I'll call her. It turned out she had 2 of his photo albums. So we managed to marry the photo albums back with the uniforms, and all that stuff goes on display at the same time at the museum. Austin was credited with 1 victory on the 4th of November 1918 during a bombing raid. I think it was the last bombing raid of the 166. The latest issue of Over the Front, which is, I'm embarrassed to say, the summer issue of last year, there was copies of it, Carl, were there copies?
Yeah, there were
Copies
4
of it had the
copies.
DH9s on the front, there's a photo essay on the 166 in there, a lot of that material came from Lieutenant Austin's collection. And this is actually a photograph from the 4th of November mission on which he was credited with a Fokker D7. Case number 6, the RAF contribution, the RFC RAF contributions. We have a couple of guys in here. One I won't talk about specifically, but this guy right here, Howard Bartlett Bradley, was a New Jersey pilot, unfortunately shot down in July of 1918. Frank Henry Beaufort, native of Alabama. We have his cap, the service cap that you see wearing here. Good photograph of him. A couple other bits and pieces. Beaufort was assigned to the 104 Squadron, the independent force. If you know that, I'm sure Steve could give you chapter and verse on it, Steve Sutterby. But these guys were one of the very first strategic bombing missions on the British side. They were bombing industrial targets in the Rhine Valley using DH-9s, DH-4s, and Handley Pages at night, FE-2s I believe as well. 104 was a DH-9 unit. Here's Beaufort, as I pointed out. The man to his right, our left, is Jimmy Valentine from New Jersey, the only 2 Americans in the unit at the time. This was before they shipped out from England. So you can see our guys were over there fairly early, and if you didn't know that these were 2 Americans, you would assume that these were British subjects, but both of them had family relations in England and claimed British citizenship and ended up with the RAF. These guys that went into the Rhine Valley had to deal with home defense fighters constantly. Fokker D7s, as you see here, this is Yasta 78B, and Albatross D5s, D3s. This is my depiction of that. If you have that issue I was talking about, the summer issue, this is the cover art from that issue. What is evident in the article, but it's not evident from looking at these rather nice looking airplanes, is that the engines are awful. The Siddelli Pumi was an awful engine. And if you read the mission reports for these guys, there's always 2 or 3 airplanes or 4 airplanes dropping out before they even get to lines with engine issues. So by the time they get across the lines, get attacked, go out, home defense fighters attack them, drop their load, come back, and be chased just about all the way home with these poorly performing airplanes. These guys took tremendous losses. And if you read the history of the independent force, it's hard for me to believe that they were continuing this bombing campaign, which had so very little material effect for the losses that they were suffering. Beaufort was one of the unfortunates that didn't come back. I believe it was August 22nd, 1918. He was flying on a mission, across the lines, came under AA fire. One of the AA shells blew the wings off of his airplane. His airplane in formation dropped through and landed on another DH-9 and took both airplanes down at the same time. His service cap survived, and how many folks are familiar with this bronze medallion? This medallion was given to every family that lost someone in service by the Brits with his name engraved on it. It's about that big, but they call it the death penny for good purpose. So we're fortunate to have that, and Beaufort's cap, and obviously a wonderful portrait photograph of him to commemorate his service.
Mike, I'm pretty sure that the 204 Squadron was not in the independent force.
104.
104.
104.
Okay. 104 was not.
If I said 204, it's 104.
Yeah, I probably just wrote it down wrong.
If
I'm pretty sure it's
Steve
not.
was taking a nap, it's still 104.
Yeah, it's they were probably on the British sector at the front as a bombing squadron.
So 104, 99.
104 was independent force, and it was operating
Yeah.
out of
Angela.
in the Vosges section, sector.
that's true.
204 was a camel unit,
That's true.
and that was in Flanders.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
We have this nice little group from Archibald, Livingston, Allen, another New Jersey guy, surprise, surprise. Interestingly, he may be the very first volunteer to the RFC from New Jersey. He was over in 1915, got his license early in 1916, as you see down here. was retained as an instructor for a few months, and then was kicked out of the RFC for reasons I haven't figured out yet. I don't know why that was. I don't know if it was a conduct issue or what, but he ended up back in the States, came back and went into the civilian inventory and ended up working as an instructor, as a contract instructor for the U.S. Air Service flying in Mineola. So they had civilian pilot instructors working with the military in 1917, 1918. The wings, I'm sure, are reproduction. The other material, I don't know if this belongs to Alan or not. It came with his FAI certificate, but the original owner didn't know whether these were his or not. But it's unique. To me, it's unique because he's one of the very first, if not the very first, New Jersey guy with the RFC. And I mentioned that I've been working on this project about the New Jersey aviators for 40 years. This will show you how long things take and how difficult it is to find things sometimes. 40 years is a long time. You haven't figured that out. Up until a couple of years ago, I had thought that I had completely exhausted the New Jersey contribution, 761 at the time. A friend of mine who's a collector came across this RAF uniform and the logbook that went with it. The pilot's name is John William Lyell. Turns out he's from New Jersey. A guy I had to add to the collection after 40 years. Another guy I had to add to the biography list after 40 years. Trained in Canada, went to England as an instructor, was retained in England as an instructor. There is a consolidated list of all the U.S. Air Service pilots. There is no consolidated list of all the French volunteers or all the British volunteers. So these guys sort of appear when they appear. And fortunately, we were able to obtain this uniform and this logbook. What I find odd about a lot of these is I have logbooks and uniforms and memorabilia from some guys. I don't have a photograph of them. And it's almost impossible to find. This may be my favorite case. U.S. training in England and Italy. And I'm going to give you two quick stories to illustrate why. This is Duncan and Charlie Grant from Vermont. Duncan was actually born in New Jersey, Plainfield, New Jersey. Charlie Grant, how many people know Charlie Grant's name? Somebody else? Okay. Charlie Grant was responsible for, he tells me, slotted flaps, delta wing configuration, and he was one of the first guys to invent a practical retractable landing. He's a Princeton University student, learned to fly at their field in 1917 before the U.S. entered the war. His brother Duncan and he were always interested in aviation. This is Charlie in 1910 in Peru, Vermont, with one of his designs. Think about this, 1910. I have photographs of him and his model airplanes in 1910. Airplanes flying, 2 fuselages, 2 propellers, single wing, dihedral. Him and his brother were so interested in aircraft that they built this glider in 1910. This is Charlie here. This is Duncan out on the end of the wing. His father, who was a Baptist priest, called it the contraption of the devil and forbade them to fly it. They attempted to fly it once. They crashed it. They convinced Mom to help sew the fabric back on the wings, and then in 1910, the summer of 1910, in a place called Cosmos Meadow in Peru, Vermont, Charlie Grant became the first person to fly in Vermont, even though it was an unpowered flight. So this is kind of my introduction to Charlie Grant. I met Charlie in 1986 on my first road trip with my future wife. So my idea of a date was to take her to Vermont to visit a 94-year-old World War I pilot and his 96-year-old wife. And she had a great time. And that's how I knew that this was the right one. So we managed, in addition to my friendship with Charlie, he used to call me constantly. Every time there was an airplane crash, he would call me and tell me why, when he was in his 90s. In addition to all that, and a wonderful collection of photographs from the family, we also have Duncan's original wings, his helmet. I'm not positive these goggles are period, but they came with this anyway as Duncan's, and his original face mask. Duncan was killed in a mid-air collision in England in May of 1918 during a dogfight training mission. Another student from New England ran into his tail. Both airplanes crashed. and unfortunately Duncan's airplane caught fire. He was killed in the collision. Charlie later went on to join Grover Loaning as an engineer. He worked on the Gordon Bennett racers in the 1920s. If you know the RB-1, that airplane, slotted flaps, slotted flaps, leading edge slats, retractable landing gear. Very modern airplane for the time. Charlie was on the design team for that. Told me a bunch of stories about how the guys would sit around and try to figure out how to make the airplane fly better and design these innovative structures for the wings. Philip Kassam, another New Jersey guy from West Orange, trained in Italy, and this fellow is probably responsible for my lifelong obsession with this subject. I met Phil when I was 17 years old. I was working on my private pilot's license at the time. And the reason I picked him was because he was close enough for me to get to his house on a bus. I didn't have a car, I didn't have a license. He lived in Princeton, New Jersey. I was about 15 miles away in Ewing Township. And when I met him, Phil was 83 years old. He had not spoken to anybody about his World War I service. Nobody was particularly interested in it at the time. And I didn't know anything about anything. If I knew half what I know now when I visited him, I'd still be interviewing him today, 40 years later. I'd still have questions for him, but I literally didn't know anything. But I was a member of the league at the time. I picked up a random issue of the journal that was being published, and it was about Foggia. And I had no idea he trained at Foggia. And when I went to interview him, which was going to be a series of, oh my God, you flew Spads, oh my God, you flew Farmans, oh my God, oh my... That would have been the interview. I gave him the issue of the journal, and there were photographs of places he had flown and people he had known. And as soon as he saw a photograph of a building or a place or somebody, he went into a story about it. So it was a completely lucky shot. We traded aviation stories. He was telling me about his solo flight, and I was telling him I was just getting ready to go on my solo flight. And he showed me this little collection of stuff, his watch, this is a reunion medal from 1967, his Italian wings from 1967, some other stuff, his FAI certificate, and his original Tiffany wings. When I told him I was getting ready to go on my solo flight, I was going to take my private pilot's test not too long after that, I assumed, when I was 17, he went upstairs and he brought these wings downstairs and he gave them to me. He said, take these with you, they'll bring you good luck. And so apparently they did. But they also cemented that interest in this subject that I obviously 40 years later is still as vivid as it was when I was 17. And Charlie trained in Italy, as I pointed out, in 1917, 1918. But he found out that he was training for these Crony bombers. And he told me that he would go around to the adjutant every day and lobby to get sent to France because he didn't want to be a bomber pilot, he wanted to be a fighter pilot. And the adjutant kept saying, you're here, you're a bomber pilot, that's it. You're going to fly Capronis. But in the spring 1918, an order came down for I think 30 or 35 pilots to be sent to France for fighter training. And Kassam's plane was the first one on the list because he had been down there giving this guy grief for so long. So he's ultimately sent to France. He was sent to Tours first, and then to Issoudun at the 3rd AIC, and ultimately to the 213th Aero Squadron. The only problem with the 213th assignment was he had spent so long training in Italy, and he'd spent so long retraining as a fighter pilot, he didn't get there until 5 days before the war ended. So he gets there on the 6th of November, 1918. They assign him an airplane, which happens to be, by the way, this airplane right here, number 6 in the back. You can't see the tail number, I'll show it to you in a second. And he gets that airplane to fly after the war, but he doesn't get any combat experience. He doesn't go over the lines. The last few days of the war were awful, weather-wise, to begin with. But he kept everything he touched. Every travel order, every photograph, every letter home that he wrote to his parents, everything, including this manual for the SPAD. You see the tail number 7731. That's this airplane right here, 7731. That's Kassam's airplane. It was handed down from Charles Gray, who was a 213th ace. And then his assignment orders to the 213th there. So let me just go back real quick. So after he passed away, his wife, who was considerably younger, I think she was 25 years younger than he was, invited me to come back because there was a few other things that he wanted me to have. And one of the few other things that he wanted me to have was his footlocker. And it had letters and photographs and a propeller tip from that airplane and all kinds of great stuff in it. And she said, I have one other thing I want to give you. I don't know if you want it, but if, you can have it if you like. And she brought down a stack of letters that he had written to his parents during the war. There was 114 letters that he'd written to his parents. And in some of the letters there were photographs. And one of them contained the barograph record from his altitude test flight at Foggia. And another one had a letter to his mom where he was describing a forced landing on a beach while he was down at gunnery school. And he said, I'm waiting for the mechanics to show up to get my airplane started again, but I'm out on the beach collecting seashells and I put one in the letter for you, Mom. And that seashell was still in that letter when I got it. Legacy of the Lafayette. We talked about the Lafayette Escadrille earlier. We were fortunate to acquire 2 uniforms that belonged to a Lafayette pilot, 103rd Air Squadron, 103rd Air Squadron pilot. As you know, the Lafayette Escadrille was absorbed into the U.S. Air Service and became the 103rd Air Squadron. This uniform grouping was Dudley Manchester from Connecticut. There are 2 uniforms in the grouping. The one we saw here, quickly. This uniform, there's another one that he wore after the war. That was also in the group, but it also included his flight helmet, his goggles, some photographs, some paperwork, and 103rd Air Squadron SPAD that Manchester had been flying. This is why I go off on the tangent and say, oh, did you know that Hobie Baker and James Norman Hall were in 103rd Air Squadron? Does everybody know who Hobie Baker was? Besides John Gutman. Nobody? No, Charlie, come on.
Yeah.
Okay. Is everybody embarrassed now not to say I didn't know? Hobie Baker was a Princeton University graduate in 1914. He was considered the best amateur hockey player in the nation at the time. The trophy for the best, what's considered the best, what's voted the best amateur hockey player, college hockey player in the nation is still called the Hobie Baker Trophy. So, next time I ask the question, I want to see many. James Norman Hall, everybody knows James Norman Hall, Charles Nordhoff, Mutant on the Bounty, the same unit. On that uniform was this beautiful wing by Johnson and Company. It looks very much like the Tiffany wing. It's got some subtle differences. And this squadron pin by Gardier. These are very, very, very hard to come by. But we were fortunate to have both of those for that display. Many of you know that the Lafayette have a memorial monument in France, at Saint-Cloud. I was fortunate to go there a few years ago in 2009. And I brought those Tiffany wings with me from the States to go to the monument. When I got there, there was nobody. I mean, literally, there was nobody there. It was me, my French companion, and nobody. The curator, or the attendant there, eventually showed up, and her husband, this fellow here, showed up as well. He didn't speak a word English. His wife was quite fluent. And I was explaining to them why I was there and my interest in that. And I brought out the wings and I said, these wings haven't been in France since 1918. And as soon as I said it, she translated it and he ran, literally ran. He just like ran away from me like I said something bad to him. He just took off. And I didn't ask where he was going. 10 minutes later he came back and he had this with him, which is an original flag from the Lafayette that they only bring out on Memorial Day, at their Memorial Day service every year. And his wife said, since you basically showed us yours, so we're going to show you ours. And brought out this flag, and I was honored to be able to see this that day at the monument, you know, in tribute to these guys, these American pilots who served with the French. The other great thing about that day was this was before the restoration was done and the crypt was closed, but that didn't prevent them from taking me down into the crypt. So I got to spend time down in that crypt with, you know, before it was quite finished. If you've never been there, if you've never been to this spot, if you go to France, if you're an aviation enthusiast, if you're a World War I aviation enthusiast, put this on your list. This is a remarkable place. I love this about the monument. I always put this up when talking about the monument at all. This kind of homage to the Sioux head is on that monument. They have one of these carved as well, but I just thought this was very clever. And Memorial Day 2016, most of you know that there was a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the founding of Lafayette, and that the U.S. Air Force provided this flyover for the event. Last uniform I'll talk about, so that you guys can finish your maps here. Balloon tunic that we recently acquired. Oddly enough, guy from New Jersey. First balloon tunic I've had my hands on, it turned out to be a guy from New Jersey. Gilbert Rogers, these things just, you know, when you think the stars are going to align just the right way, they do. You know, the balloon observer's duties were to range artillery fire and not observe from a stationary position. The tunics are very rare. The fact that this one is named to a New Jersey guy and identified to a New Jersey guy is super rare. It's also got this wonderful bullion, silver bullion wing. Now, this officer, let me go back to that slide again. This officer was stationed in Bordeaux right at the end of the war. The tunic is immaculate. It looks like it's been worn about 5 times. The wing is perfect. Everything about it was so nice that when I first saw it, I said, "This can't be true. This can't be real." But it's obviously genuine. The provenance on it is very good, and it turns out, when I looked this guy's service record up, he was stationed in Bordeaux for a couple of weeks right before he came home. So I'm pretty sure what happened was he said, "You know what? When I get off of that boat, I want to look good." So he bought another walking out tunic and decked it out, and we're the fortunate recipients of that. When can you see these and where? You can see these at the Golden Age Air Museum in Bethel, Pennsylvania. As I pointed out earlier, this year our World War I event is on the 14th and 15th. I will tell you that we have events every month. We're open every weekend, but the World War I collection does not come out until that date and only on those dates. We don't have an environmentally controlled museum. We have hangars with airplanes in them with display cases. And in order to preserve this material, we don't leave it out in the elements. So if you want to see this stuff, more than what you've already seen, and see the airplanes that go with them, the 14th and the 15th is where we'll be. And where are we? It's about 4 hours from DC, as I pointed out. We're right off of Route 78. I mean, we're literally right off of Route 78. So you come up 83, get to 81, shoot out to 78. It's about 40 minutes from Harrisburg, once you hit that mark. And you will not, like I pointed out earlier, Grimes is the exit, Bethel is the town. Bethel has one traffic light and a Sheets. Everybody familiar with Sheets? Mm-hmm. It's like a glorified Wawa with a gas station attached to it.
They don't get much Wawa down here either.
Okay, so it's glorified, whatever you guys have down here, 7-Eleven, I don't know what it is. But it's like that, and that's our version of civilization up in Bethel. It's mostly cow country, mostly farms around that area.